It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and with us to talk about the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola is Father Sean Salai. Thanks for being here, Father Sean.
It's great to be with you, Kyle.
Did you discover St. Ignatius first or the Jesuits?
I discovered both at the same time, really.
Okay.
I suppose I was a summer student at Georgetown when I was in college, and I sort of found out about the Jesuits and St. Ignatius around the same time.
And then what drew you to become a Jesuit?
The spirituality attracted me. You know, I was kind of discerning whether to be a priest and what kind of priest to be. I was working as a newspaper reporter at the Washington Times in D.C., and I was very drawn to the mission-oriented spirituality of the Jesuits, to the prayer with the imagination of Ignatius, to the sense of discernment. And I couldn't see myself as a monk. I really was drawn to that kind of ideal of being able to go where the needs are greatest, to travel to the peripheries, to be on the front lines, so to speak, and to not just write articles about things, but to really be involved in ministries of help to souls, as Ignatius would put it.
So every once in a while, I think it comes up in Catholic conversation or with really holy people. They talk about the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Can you explain what the spiritual exercises are?
The spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are essentially a handbook for retreat directors. It's something that Ignatius wrote out of his own personal experience of conversion after a battle at Pamplona in 1521, where he was serving as a captain in the Spanish army against an invading French army. He was wounded by a cannonball, and he ended up convalescent for about 10 months in bed at home at his castle in Loyola, Spain. And he started questioning, where's my life going? You know, in a few years, where am I going to be? And he imagined, you know, returning to the army and where his life would take him. But he began reading the life of Christ by Ludolf of Saxony and the lives of the saints, the Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragine. And he started to have a change of heart. And he felt drawn to do what the great saints did, to do what Jesus did, and to follow in that path. And gradually, he had the problem of trying to figure out, well, what voice is coming from God here? Mm-hmm. You know, is God calling me back to the army? Is God calling me to completely do a 180 in my life right now? And what happened was he ended up in a cave in Manresa, Spain, where he spent about 10 months after his recovery. And he would pray with the scriptures. He would pray with the notes he had taken on the life of Christ and imagine himself in the scene. And so after he left the army and went on a pilgrimage that led him to Jerusalem and finally to found the Jesuits, he had created this handbook with a method of prayer that would help people go through a similar discernment in life, to say that, what choices am I making in my life? Whether it's a big choice to be a priest or to be married, or maybe I've already made a big choice and now I'm kind of trying to figure out, how do I live that choice out in small ways? And so the spiritual exercises are really designed for that. They're designed to help the serious Christian who is nevertheless a bit unsatisfied with his or her life and is looking to deepen the relationship with Christ and go a little bit further.
So how exactly do they work?
Well, there's a lot of different forms you can make them. Flexibility is a hallmark of Ignatius, and so
that's good.
The full form, you could do a 30-day silent retreat, which I did as a Jesuit novice.
Wow.
For 30 days, you pray 4 or 5 hours a day over distinct passages or imaginative exercises he creates. Or a lot of people don't have time for that. You could do an 8-day retreat, which every Jesuit makes annually outside of the 30-day retreats he makes in his life. And if that doesn't work, you can do a 5-day retreat, you can do a 3-day retreat. And one of the challenges that people today have is even that's too much sometimes. You know, there's a lot of serious Christians out there who just don't have the time or the money or maybe even the inclination to go on a weekend retreat in a retreat house. You know, this new book that I've edited for TAN Books, The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola with Points for Personal Prayer from Jesuit Spiritual Masters, is designed as a do-it-yourself retreat. And so this is the only hardcover edition of the book out there with a ribbon marker right now on the U.S. market, because it's designed to look like a prayer book. And we wanted it to be a devotional edition so that when people open it, they don't just encounter kind of this bewildering array of 16th century vocabulary and concepts and terminology. But throughout the book, interspersed are these pre-lections and journal exercises. So you have these brief little introductions to key points in the retreat, and then you have kind of a life of a saint. So there's a Jesuit saint who's quoted, or a great Jesuit spiritual figure like Jean Danelou. And then after that little biography, you have some reflection questions. And so anybody could pick up the book and start anywhere and just try to pray through it a little bit by herself or himself. And so that's what we're looking for here, is to make the exercises more available to people who are very well intentioned, and they know the exercise's reputation. They know that many great saints have been formed by the exercises, that popes have recommended them for 500 years. And at the same time, they're just struggling in life, and they don't have that leisure and that income to go out and make a retreat. So this is kind of a compendium, a one-stop shop of Ignatian wisdom on the text. And one of the great things about the book is that as you read through it and try to pray it, you're being guided by saints who themselves were guided by the text.
Right.
So you've got a little quote from Gerard Manley Hopkins, or you have a quote from St. Francis Xavier, St. Peter Faber, St. Ignatius himself, St. Stanislaus Kostka, all the great saints, Robert Bellarmine, Peter Canisius, doctors of the church. It's a handy way for people to get into the text without feeling the need to buy 4 more books to understand it,
Right.
or to buy an encyclopedia, or to buy a dictionary. And so what I've done in this book is I've compressed years of my own personal reading of different sources, and I've just taken the kind of essential points out to help kind of guide people and lead them. And, it's not a perfect system. There's going to be confusion. There's going to be parts that still don't make sense. A lot of it depends on one's familiarity with Catholic piety of a certain era. But at the same time, I think that this is an effort that's going to make the text more available. It's a translation that Tan picked up in the early 1900s. It was a translation by the Catholic Publication Society of a French translation of the exercises by Father Charles Duplass. And so there's also a historical preface at the beginning of the book that kind of sets the scene. It explains what the exercises are, kind of how this translation came about. It was very popular. It went through 33 editions in France, came to the U.S., and Tan has been republishing it since 1999. At the same time, it's a bit of a pastoral paraphrase of the text, so it's not a literal translation, but Duplass put in supplementary meditations. He put in things that Ignatius suggested but left to the imagination of the retreatant. So this text really comes stuffed with a lot of supplemental things to help the person pray.
Yeah, and curious of your personal experience with a 30-day or an 8-day silent retreat, going through these spiritual exercises. What have been some of the fruits from doing that? How does that help guide you in discernment?
Well, the text itself, praying with it for 30 days, praying with it for 8 days every year since I entered the Jesuits in 2005, has been a great disposition toward flexibility, towards adaptability in my life. The goal of the exercises is to know God's will and do it. That's about as succinctly as you can sum up. Yeah. And a lot of Christians kind of struggle with that question. Well, how do I know what God wants for me? And so this is a way that I have found helpful for me of letting God speak to me through the scriptures. There's some similarities with Lectio Divina, and at the same time, the exercises include vocal prayer, meditation, contemplation, and it's not meant as something to be read cover to cover and simply done as a homework assignment, but really to go where the Spirit moves you, go where you're finding fruit in the text, and stick with that. So the graces of the text, to know myself as a sinner loved by God, to follow Christ as a disciple, as a missionary, the grace to suffer with Christ in his passion, the grace to rise to new life with Christ, really follows the cycle of Christ's life in the Gospels, so that I felt like I was walking with him. And there were times in the text where I would imagine myself with the disciples as Jesus came down the mountain of the Transfiguration, And I would have these incredibly rich and deep prayer experiences where I would sense God speaking to me through my thoughts and feelings, which is what Ignatius was aiming at. And to figure out, well, which thoughts and feelings are coming from God, which thoughts and feelings are coming from the evil spirit, which are just simply background noise and distraction. This is a challenging text. And I think that it's worth the attempt. It's something that I'm not even sure I really knew how to pray before I did the retreat, because a lot of my prayer was vocal prayer, which is important, ritual prayers like the Our Father, or vocal prayer like words made up to God. But at the same time, prayer is a conversation. And so when am I listening? And when I'm listening, what am I hearing? So it goes beyond just me talking and then sitting in silence and saying, well, I guess it's a mystery, I'm gone. The exercises really gets at learning to recognize and hear God's voice, which speaks a little bit differently for each person.
Well, and the book is broken down into 4 different weeks, and then there's days within the weeks and exercises within the days. Is that how you would recommend that people do that over the course of 4 weeks, or could you just pick it up and read it like you would a regular book?
You could pick it up and read it however you like. The 4-week structure belongs to Ignatius. With the days, it's kind of set up as a 30-day retreat in that way. And at the same time, he's got annotations and introductions which explain that, you don't have to do it that way. And so there's ways you can make the retreat throughout the year in what we call the 19th annotation retreat. That's the number 19 in the book, where he talks about, okay, you don't have time to go to a retreat house. Well, once a week you can meet with the spiritual director and they can kind of take you through the text. And you pray once a day, and it goes for months instead of 30 days, and then you get through the same thing. Or you can do an 18th annotation, which is kind of a preached version of the retreat. Like a lot of people will go to preached weekend retreats at Jesuit retreat houses. In this sense, I really hope that readers will feel free to pray the book however moves them. There's a lot of ways that we really want to make this a transformative experience. Ignatius saw the exercises as something to be done more than read. And so they're not the same thing as the Interior Castle or the Imitation of Christ, where it's a mystical treatise that I'm reading for spiritual enlightenment. Or the goal for Ignatius was change my life, Lord. I really am asking you to direct my life, to have you at the center of my life so that I can follow you where you're leading me. And so it's a very practical spirituality. With Ignatius's life, he had a very practical decision to make. After he recovered, he had a limp. He could have gone back on the path his life was taking him. And yet he started to ask, what if I did what St. Francis of Assisi did, or what St. Dominic did? And he was very much a knight of the Middle Ages in his imagination. And so he was always looking for a sovereign to serve. And God, really, he refers to God as that kind of supreme commander or that king. So there's a little bit of military imagery in the exercises, that these kinds of things can be intimidating. And it may not be for everybody. There could be some people who just pick up the book and they're drawn to what he calls the 3 ways of praying, where you kind of do a rhythmic sort of breathing as you pray through the Our Father. And there are other people who may dig very deeply into meditations like the 2 standards, where he asks you to imagine 2 opposing armies, and on one side is Christ with the standard or the battle flag of the cross, and on the other side is Satan.
All right. Well, where can people go to get a copy of the book?
They can go to Amazon.com, they can go to TAN, they can go to any bookstore and have them order it. Just look up the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola with Points for Personal Prayer from Jesuit Spiritual Masters, Father Sean, S-E-A-N, Salai, S-A-L-A-I.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Father Sean, for sharing this with us. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Kyle. It's good to be with you today.